She whispered it into the dark kitchen, so quiet that only the walls could hear. I am sorry we are such a burden. She did not know the man was standing in the doorway. She did not know he had heard her. He crossed the room, took her hands, and said 5 words that changed everything. You are meant to be here. But before that moment, before those words, there was a frozen road in Nebraska, a broken wagon, and a woman digging her husband's grave with bare hands in ground so cold it bled her knuckles to the bone. This is how she got there. The blood came before the hole was half a foot deep. The ground was frozen solid, hard as stone, and the shovel was so dull that every strike only chipped away a few crumbs no bigger than a penny. Inside the barn, baby Rosie was crying, a weak, hoarse sound more like a kitten left out in the cold than a child not yet 2 years old. Clara did not stop digging. Her husband lay on a plank behind her, covered in an old blanket already cold since before dawn. Nebraska in December was no place for grief. The wind came across the flatland like it had a score to settle, scraping ice crystals off the frozen dirt and throwing them against her face. Her hands were raw and split along the knuckles, the skin peeling back in thin ribbons that stuck to the wooden handle. She could not feel most of her fingers anymore. That should have frightened her, but it didn't. She was past frightened, past tired, past everything except the simple mechanical motion of lifting the shovel and bringing it down again. Nettie stood 10 feet away, holding Rosie against her chest, inside a wool blanket that had gone threadbare at the corners. The baby's cries came in fits and starts, small gasps of sound that rose and faded like wind through a cracked window. Daniel, 8 years old, stood behind his sister with tears frozen on his cheeks. He was not making any noise. That was worse somehow. Thomas, just 6, stood like a wooden post, eyes fixed on the shape under the blanket. He had not spoken since his father stopped breathing. Clara lifted the shovel, brought it down, lifted it again. She remembered the last thing Henry said. Not the final breath, which came quiet and without ceremony, just a rattle and then nothing. But the words before that in the fever haze when his hand found hers and squeezed with a strength that surprised her. His eyes were glassy, looking at something she could not see. Find someone, he whispered. Someone who can shelter them. Don't be alone. She had nodded. A promise made to a dying man is the heaviest kind, because you can never ask him what he meant. You can never say I tried and it wasn't enough. You just carry it. The hole took 3 hours. It was not deep enough and not straight, but it would have to do. She rolled Henry into it, wrapped in the blanket because she had no coffin and no money for one. She filled the dirt back in and stood over the mound with her 4 children around her and said nothing. There was no preacher, no prayer she could find inside herself that didn't feel like a lie. She just stood there until her legs went numb, then picked up Rosie and walked back inside. 3 days later, the banker came. He had smooth hands and a pressed collar and a voice like oiled leather, pleasant on the surface and slick underneath. He stood in the doorway of her home and told her the debt exceeded the value of the property. They would be taking the mule as well. She had 48 hours. Clara did not argue. She had seen this moment coming long before Henry died. The crops had failed 2 seasons in a row. The loan had grown teeth. She signed what needed signing and watched the banker walk back to his carriage without looking back. His boots left clean prints in the mud. He never once looked at the children. That evening, sorting through Henry's Sparkers by candlelight while the children slept, Clara found it. A letter already opened, folded inside a seed catalog. It was from a Pastor Wills in Montana Territory, and pinned to it was a small newspaper clipping, the ink smudged but still readable. Rancher in Montana Territory seeks wife. Will accept widow with children. Good land, honest work, decent shelter. Inquire through Pastor Wills, Elk Crossing, Montana. Henry had read this letter before he died. He had kept it, hidden it from her, maybe because he didn't want to scare her, or maybe because he was already planning ahead, already knowing the fever would take him and his family would need a way out. Clara held the letter close to the candle and read it twice more. Then she sat in the dark for a long time, listening to her children breathe. In the morning, she wrote her reply. Short, direct, no begging. I am a widow, 28 years old with 4 children. I can cook, sew, and manage a household. I am not looking for pity. I am looking for a chance to work. If you still need someone, I will come before Christmas. The reply came 9 days later through Pastor Wills. Also short. Come. I will be waiting at Elk Crossing. Silas Drummond. She sold what little was left. The kitchen table brought 40 cents. The rocking chair Henry had built for Nettie's first year brought $1. She packed one trunk with clothes and blankets and what food she could carry and bought passage on the stagecoach heading west. The journey took 3 weeks. 3 weeks of frozen roads and cramped benches and stops at relay stations where the coffee tasted like burned dirt and the bread was so stale it cracked when you broke it. Daniel developed a cough on the second day that settled into his chest and would not leave. Rosie ran a low fever that came and went like a tide. Nettie did not complain, not once. She held her sister Federer brothers, braided her own hair each morning without a mirror, and kept her eyes forward. She was 10 years old and already carried herself like someone who had stopped expecting kindness from the world. Thomas said almost nothing for the entire trip. He sat by the window and watched the landscape change from flat brown farmland to rolling hills to white nothing. Sometimes Clara caught him mouthing words to himself, silent conversations with someone only he could see. Once in the middle of the night at a relay station in Wyoming Territory, Clara woke to find Thomas standing at the window staring out at the dark. She asked him what he was looking at. He said, "I am looking for Pa." She did not know what to say to that. She pulled him close and held him until he fell asleep, standing up, his small body heavy against her chest. At every stop, Clara counted heads. 4 children, 1 trunk. Whatever money she had left, folded into a handkerchief and pinned inside her dress. The numbers got smaller as the days wore on. A meal here, a blanket rental there. By the time they reached Montana Territory, she had less than $3 to her name and a letter from a man she had never met, promising a life she could not imagine. The stagecoach left them at the last town before the mountains. The driver said the road ahead was buried under 4 feet of snow, and he would not risk his horses. Clara stood on the wooden sidewalk with her 4 children and her 1 trunk and watched the coach pull away. She hired a wagon, old with a cracked axle and wheels that groaned with every turn. The horse that came with it was thin and tired and looked at Clara with the resigned expression of an animal that had stopped expecting much from the world. The man who rented it to her looked at the children and then at the sky and shook his head slowly. 40 miles, he said. That is a long way in this weather. I know, Clara said, and took the reins. The wheel broke 20 miles out. Somewhere between the frostbitten prairie and the nothing beyond it, the rear axle split with a sound like a gunshot. The wagon lurched sideways and slid into a ditch, its frame half buried in snow, half buried in silence. Clara climbed down and stood beside it, her fingers red and stiff around the reins that led to nowhere. The wind scraped across her face like the edge of a blade, lifting strands of her hair and throwing them against her cheek. Her shawl was too thin for December, too thin for grief. Daniel coughed behind her. The sound came out small, like something already surrendering. The plain stretched in every direction, white and gray and blank. Not a tree for shelter, not a fence post for comfort. Just sky and snow and the long ache of absence. Rosie's breathing was worse now, shallow and wet, each inhale a small battle. Nettie had curled herself around the baby like a bird shielding its egg. Daniel and Thomas sat shoulder to shoulder, silent and sunken. 4 children wrapped in blankets that were not thick enough, riding in a wagon that would no longer move, following a mother who did not know if there was anything at the end of this road. Clara's feet had stopped hurting. That was something, and the cold had numbed her through and through, and part of her wondered if she would still feel it when death came. Maybe it would be quiet, peaceful, like sleep she did not have to wake from. She closed her eyes and for one moment let herself imagine it, lying down in the snow, letting the white cover her. No more digging, no more walking, no more pretending she was strong enough for this. Then Nettie's voice came from the wagon bed. Not a cry, not a plea, just a flat, steady statement in the voice of a child who already understood too much. "Mama, Rosie is getting very cold." Clara opened her eyes. She did not turn around. She gripped the reins tighter, felt the leather bite into her palms through the numbness, and she started walking, one foot dragging the other. The wagon creaked behind her. She did not know how she would fix the wheel, did not know where she was going, but the wind was behind her now, and that counted for something. Around midday, the clouds broke open, not into sun, but into a low blue sky, the color of old bruises. She saw smoke, faint straight lines lifting from the valley ahead. A house maybe, or a fire. She did not let herself believe it until she smelled wood smoke. Real, warm, thick with pine sap. She walked faster. The wagon groaned. Daniel whimpered. She crested the last ridge and saw it. A ranch house low to the ground flanked by 2 sheds and a windmill, turning slow in the stiff air. Fenced pasture lay beyond where a dozen cattle stood in the snow, steam rising off their hides. Her legs gave out. She hit the ground hard, knees first, hands catching in the crusted snow. She was too tired to cry, too tired to pray. Her breath came in short bursts. For a moment, she just stared at the chimney smoke curling up into that bruised sky. A crunch of boots in snow reached her ears. She flinched and looked up. A man stood a few yards away, broad and still. He had a rifle slung on his shoulder and a coat that looked older than the hills. His face was carved, not grown. Leathery and wind-worn, with a mouth set in a straight line that gave away nothing. He did not speak. Clara opened her mouth, but no sound came. Just air in the shape of a word she could not finish. Then Nettie's voice behind her, clear and cracking. "Mama." The man looked at the wagon, at the children huddled under thin blankets, at the half-collapsed frame tilted in the snow, at the woman on her knees before him with blood dried on her hands and frost in her hair. His eyes softened. Just a hair. Just enough to be real. He stepped forward. "You come from the east." She nodded. He looked at the children again, at the broken wagon, at her knees in the snow. Then he pulled off his gloves and knelt down beside her. "I am not going to ask what brought you here in this shape," he said. His voice was low, rough, like gravel rolled in cloth. "But you look like you need somewhere to stay." She tried to say thank you, but the words caught. He helped her to her feet. His hands were warm, rough and calloused and warm. "My name is Silas," he said. "Let us get your young ones inside." The heat inside the ranch house hit her like a wave, almost unbearable after so many days in the cold. Clara staggered over the threshold, lightheaded and half-blind as the scent of smoke and old pine boards wrapped around her. She heard Nettie gasp, heard Daniel drop to the floor beside the stove. No one spoke. The silence held everything. Grief, hunger, fear. And the wooden walls took it in like they had heard it all before. Silas moved quietly, no questions asked. He carried the children in one by one, holding Rosie against his chest like she was made of glass. He said nothing about the cracked skin on her face, the wet cough she could not shake. He just brought her in, laid her beside the stove, and covered her with a wool blanket worn thin at the edges. Clara stood in the doorway, half in shadow, until Silas looked at her. Not hard, not soft either, just steady. "Come on," he said. She followed. He handed her a tin cup of coffee. It burned her hands and her throat, but she did not care. She drank half of it in one swallow and felt it light a small, stubborn fire inside her chest. It was not comfort exactly, but it was something like living. Silas knelt by the stove and stirred the coals. The children dozed around him like pups near warmth. Firelight flickered across his face, casting deep lines and softening others. Clara watched him and then spoke. Her voice was raw, scraped thin by cold and crying, but it did not waver. "You posted the advertisement. For a wife, I'm here with 4 children and a broken wagon. Do you still want to keep the arrangement?" Silas looked at her for a long moment. His jaw worked once like he was chewing on the words before letting them out. "I am not in a rush," he said. "You stay here, you work. The children have a warm place. As for marrying, that is up to you. Whenever you are ready, or never, I will not press." Something shifted in the room when he said that. Clara felt it in her chest, a loosening slight but real. She was not property. He was not a buyer. They were 2 grown people negotiating how to survive. That was all. And that was enough. That night, Silas gave up his room without a word. She tried to protest, but he shook his head once and walked back out to the shed with a lantern in hand. Clara watched him through the frosted window as he crossed the snow. Boots crunching, slow and even. His back straight. Alone. The children curled up in the big bed like kittens, limp with sleep. Clara sat on the edge for a long time, staring at the wall. Her hands shook as she undressed. Her body was thinner than it had been. Wrists like kindling, ribs visible beneath the skin. She lay beside her children, one arm across Rosie's chest, and listened to the wind outside. This place was not a promise, but it was a pause, a breath, a square of warmth in a cold, uncertain world. In the morning, she rose before the sun. The sky was a pale, bruised, thin light creeping across the white hills. She slipped out of bed, wrapped herself in a heavy flannel, and stepped into the cold. Her breath fogged the air. Her boots were too small and pinched her toes, but she wore them anyway. She found the pump behind the barn and worked it until water came, her hands stiff and aching. She hauled the buckets inside, set them by the stove, and searched the pantry. Flour, lard, salt, some beans, dried apples in a tin. Enough. She started the fire again and began to cook. When Silas stepped in, he stopped just inside the door. The smell of biscuits rose in the warm air, thick and comforting. The coffee was already hot. Clara did not look up from the skillet. Figured I would get a start, she said. He nodded, sat down, pulled off his gloves. They ate in silence, not an awkward one, a working silence, the kind that understands there is too much weight on both sides of the table to speak freely. But something had changed. The worst of the cold had passed. Neither of them was alone anymore. A week later, Silas needed to ride into Elk Crossing for winter supplies and medicine for Rosie, whose cough still had not broken. Clara went with him. It was the first time she had left the ranch since arriving. Elk Crossing was small. One main road, a general store run by an older woman named Agnes Harper, the Pratchett Bank, a church, a post office, a saloon. People on the street watched Clara the way small-town folks watch a stranger. Not hostile, just measuring. Silas brought Clara into the general store. Agnes Harper was behind the counter, a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and a face that had been softened by weather rather than hardened by it. She looked at Clara, looked at the children clinging to her skirts, and smiled. The first smile Clara had received from a stranger since Henry died. "Come in, dear. It is warm in here." They were inside for perhaps 20 minutes gathering flour and salt and a small bottle of tonic the doctor had recommended. When they stepped back out onto the wooden sidewalk, a woman was waiting. Ida Pratchett stood with her arms folded across her chest and her chin lifted. She was the wife of the town banker, 55 years old, dressed in wool and righteousness. Her face had the look of granite that has been polished to a shine but was still stone underneath. She turned to Clara and spoke loud enough for the entire street to hear. "So this is the mail-order bride. I will speak plainly. In this town, we are not accustomed to the buying and selling of women through the post. 4 children besides. Who will feed them when winter drags on? The church charity fund is not a bottomless well." People stopped on the sidewalk. A few turned to watch. Near the saloon, a rancher named Clem Dawson leaned against a post and tipped his hat back, watching with half curiosity and half judgment. He shook his head and said to no one in particular, "Mail-order bride city woman will not last the first winter." Clara felt the blood rush to her face. She felt the eyes on her, felt the weight of judgment pressing in from every direction. She felt Nettie's hand tighten on her skirt, felt the girl press closer, and in that small grip, she found what she needed. She looked Ida Pratchett straight in the eyes. "I dug my husband's grave in frozen ground with my bare hands, Mrs. Pratchett. I pulled a broken wagon 20 miles through the snow with 4 children. I did not come here asking for charity. I came here to work, and I do not need anyone's permission." Silence. The kind that rings. Ida Pratchett's face reddened, her mouth opened and then closed. Behind Clara, Silas stood still. His jaw was tight and his fists were closed, but he did not step in. He did not speak for her, because he respected her enough to know she could handle it herself. Agnes Harper stepped out of the store, wiping her hands on her apron. Her voice was old but sharp as a tack. "Ida, if you spent half your energy working instead of inspecting other people's business, maybe the bank would have more customers." A few people on the street laughed quietly. Ida Pratchett turned on her heel and walked away, heels clicking. But her eyes just before she turned said one thing clearly: "This is not over." Silas did not say much on the ride home. He guided the horses and kept his eyes on the road. But halfway back, he said without looking at her, "You handled that well." Clara said nothing. She was watching the snow. The days settled into a rhythm that winter, slow and hard and oddly sacred. Morning brought chores, firewood, water, feeding the stock. Clara took to the kitchen with her sleeves rolled and her cheeks flushed and flour dusting her apron. She moved with quiet purpose, careful but never timid, Like every task was a small act of rebuilding something that had been torn down. Nettie helped without being asked, scrubbing pots and carrying wood with her jaw set like someone twice her age. But she watched Silas with cautious eyes, guarded and watchful the way a dog watches a stranger who has not yet proved himself safe. Daniel still flinched at loud noises. Thomas followed Silas around the yard, mimicking his stride, not speaking unless spoken to. Rosie was always cold, always coughing. Clara tucked her in every night with a whispered prayer, not for miracles, just for one more day. Silas did not hover, but he watched. He watched the way Clara knelt to wash laundry in the icy basin, her fingers raw and red. Watched how she brushed Rosie's hair with a tenderness that made something ache deep in his chest. He noticed the way she winced when she stood too fast. She never complained, not once, but pain clung to her like frost on the fence line. Then one night deep into January, the first real test came. A blizzard hit without warning, the kind that turns the world white and screaming in minutes. Silas discovered a cow laboring early out in the far pasture. The calf was stuck. The mother was failing. He rode out into the storm, but one man was not enough. Clara heard the commotion from the house. She wrapped Nettie in a blanket, told her to watch the children, and ran out into the blizzard. She found Silas on his knees in the snow beside the cow arms, deep face tight with effort. Without a word, Clara dropped beside him. She plunged her bare hands into the mess of blood and birth and worked alongside him like she had been doing it her whole life. The snow came sideways, the wind howled. Her dress was soaked through in minutes. She did not flinch, did not hesitate, did not make a sound except the sharp breathing of someone doing hard, necessary work. The calf came free, wet, trembling, crying thin and high into the storm. The mother licked her young steam rising from the small body. Clara sat back in the mud. Her hands were shaking. Her hair was plastered to her face. She was soaked and frozen and covered in blood. Clem Dawson happened to be riding the fence line, checking for breaks that night. He saw the whole thing through the whiteout, saw Clara on her knees in the muck delivering a calf in a blizzard, not a word of complaint, not a moment of hesitation. He did not say anything. But when their eyes met through the snow, he nodded once, slow and deliberate. That was a start. Back inside, Clara sat by the stove, shivering violently. Silas handed her a towel. Then for the first time, he sat down across from her at the kitchen table and poured her coffee before pouring his own. A small thing, but it said everything that needed saying. In late January, the snow stopped falling for a stretch of days. The air turned brittle and clear, and the moon hung low over the ranch like it had been placed there by hand. Silas was outside splitting wood late the way he did when his thoughts got too heavy for indoors. Clara stepped out onto the porch to find him. A shawl pulled tight around her. "You will freeze," she said. "Not yet." She watched him drive the axe into the log. The sound echoed against the barn walls. "You always live alone?" she asked after a long pause. Silas leaned on the handle, catching his breath. Was not always the plan. He stared out at the pasture where the cattle huddled near the fence. "Had a brother. Eli. We ran the place together until the fever took him. That was 5 winters ago. Then it was just me and the work." "I am sorry," she said. He nodded once. "Me too." They stood in the blue hush of moonlight, neither sure how to fill the space between them. Then Silas spoke again, and what he said was not what Clara expected. "The night Eli got the worst of the fever, I was in town, drinking at the saloon. When I rode back, he could not speak anymore. He died before dawn. His voice was flat, but his hand on the axe handle had gone white at the knuckles. I was not there. That is the only truth I have lived with for 5 years." Clara understood then. Silas was not just lonely, he was punishing himself. The ranch was not his home. It was his prison, the one he had chosen, the sentence he served each day in silence and hard labor, and sleeping alone in a shed when there was a perfectly good bed inside. He stayed because leaving would mean the guilt had won. He stayed because staying hurt, and he believed he deserved the hurting. Clara looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "Most days I feel like I am climbing uphill in wet boots with a baby on my back and no rope. But I am warm. The children sleep with full bellies. And you have been kind." She paused. "You did not kill your brother Silas." "The fever killed him," he did not answer. But she saw his shoulders drop, just slightly, just enough. They stood there in the cold for another minute. The moon threw their shadows long across the snow. Then Silas said, "I saved you the last slice of pie," and nodded toward the door. That was how it began between them. Not with grand declarations or bold confessions, just a slice of pie, a shared silence. A door held open when her arms were full. Little things, honest things. Silas started taking the boys out with him to the barn, teaching Daniel how to drive nails without bending them, showing Thomas how to walk around horses without spooking them. He taught Nettie how to check the rabbit traps and how to tell fresh tracks from old ones. He fixed the sole of Clara's boot without telling her, just left it by the stove one morning stitched and oiled. Spring crept in slow and hesitant. The snow melted into thick brown slush. The fields turned soft and stubborn. Silas taught Clara to ride bareback, how to feel the animal beneath her instead of fighting it. She fell once, hard, lay in the mud laughing until she cried. He offered his hand. She took it. They did not speak of the future, not yet, but they worked together like they shared a name and not just a roof. And every night when she blew out the lamp and lay in the big bed with Rosie breathing against her chest, Clara found herself listening for the sound of his boots outside the window, just to know he was still there. But the town had not forgotten her. Ida Pratchett's humiliation on the sidewalk burned in her like a coal that would not go out. She began a quiet campaign, visiting neighbors, speaking in soft, worried tones about poor Silas tricked by a scheming widow dragging her brood behind her like a chain. She suggested Clara might be a fraud, said mail-order brides were a disgrace to decent society. The gossip spread. Clara went from she to that woman in the mouths of certain people. When she rode to town for Rosie's medicine, two farmers' wives turned their backs in the store. Rosie coughed in Clara's arms, and one of them said, just loud enough, "Bringing sickness to town." How nice. Clara bought the medicine, paid in coins, walked out. Her chin leveled, her eyes on the road ahead. But that night, after the children were asleep, she sat alone in the dark kitchen, her hands wrapped around a cold cup of coffee, and she trembled. Not from cold, from hope. Because hope was the most dangerous thing a woman could feel when she had already lost everything. Nettie appeared in the doorway like a ghost, a small figure in a white nightgown, eyes too big for her face. "Mama, do people hate us?" Clara breathed in slow. "Not everyone." Nettie bit her lip and then asked the question that cut deepest. "Is Mr. Silas going to let us stay?" "Always." Clara paused for a long time. The dish in her hands still dripped water. She dried it slowly. "I do not know," she said, "but I think he wants us here." Nettie looked at her hands. He built Thomas a saddle, just his size. She was quiet for a moment. He did not have to do that. No, he did not. They said nothing more. But Clara lay awake long after the fire died, listening for the sounds of Silas moving in the barn. A man did not build a boy a saddle unless he meant to stay, or unless he wished he could. The next day the letter came. It arrived with a rider from town sealed with the heavy wax of the county clerk. Silas read it standing beneath the porch beam. His jaw worked as his eyes moved across the page. Then he handed it to Clara with the kind of quiet a man only uses when something bad has happened. She read it slowly, lips moving. A man named Harlan Cobb had filed a claim on the land Silas had been working since his brother's death. He said the deed was invalid, said the ranch belonged to his family by right. He would be coming to settle the matter before the end of the month. Clara's hands trembled as she folded the letter back along its creases. Can he do this? Silas did not answer right away. He looked out at the pasture, at the cattle moving slow through the afternoon light, at the windmill turning steady against the gray sky. If he is who he says he said finally. Maybe. Clara looked into his eyes and saw the thing she feared most. Not anger, not fight, resignation. The quiet surrender of a man who was already used to losing, who had lost his brother, lost his hope, lost 5 years to guilt and silence, and now expected to lose the only piece of earth that kept him standing. She looked past him at the children. Daniel was throwing a stick for no reason, watching it land in the mud. Thomas was sitting on the small saddle Silas had built, perched on a fence rail, pretending to ride. Nettie was inside humming something while she swept the kitchen floor. And Rosie, finally warm, finally with color in her cheeks, was sleeping in the big bed with her thumb in her mouth. Clara had lost a home once before. She had stood in front of a house she could no longer enter and watched a banker drive away without looking back. She knew that feeling. The ground opening under your feet, the sky pressing down, the children watching and understanding more than you want them to. She would not feel it again. Not here. Not when the children had just started laughing again. Not when Thomas had a saddle and Nettie had started calling this place home. Not when the coffee was hot every morning and the fire never went out at night. She folded the letter and put it in her apron pocket. She looked at Silas, and in her eyes there was no fear. Only the same quiet fire he had seen that first day when she was half dead in the snow, still walking, still pulling a broken wagon towards something she could not see. "We are not done," she said. Silas looked at her. "Not even close," Clara said, and walked back inside. For 2 days, nobody spoke about the letter. The chores did not stop because a piece of paper arrived. The cattle still needed feeding. The water still needed hauling. The stove still needed wood. Clara cooked and cleaned and mended and washed as if nothing had changed. Silas repaired the fence along the south pasture, drove nails until his hands were sore, and came in for supper with sawdust in his hair and silence in his mouth. But everything was heavier now. Every bucket of water felt like it weighed twice what it should. Every step through the mud left a print that seemed too deep. Every breath between words carried more weight than the words themselves. The letter sat on the table for those 2 days, like something alive, like something that was watching them. Rosie coughed worse at night. Thomas woke screaming from a dream in which a man in a pressed suit came to take their house away. He did not say this. He did not need to. Clara held him until the shaking stopped, and then lay awake until dawn, staring at the ceiling, counting the knots in the pine boards. Silas stayed outside longer than usual. After the lamp was blown out each night, Clara could hear his boots on the frozen ground, pacing the fence line in the dark, back and forth like a man walking the perimeter of something he was about to lose. On the third morning, gray and cold with rain, sitting low in the air, Silas stood by the stove and spoke without looking at her. "If the law sides with him, I will not fight it. But I will give you time to find somewhere else." Clara turned from the stove. Her face went pale. "Where would we go?" He looked down at his coffee. "I do not know." The silence that followed was worse than shouting, worse than grief. It filled the kitchen like water filling a jar and pushing out all the air, all the warmth, all the small, careful things they had built over the weeks. Clara set down the spoon she was holding. She wiped her hands on her apron and looked at him with eyes that did not blink. "You think we are just passing through? I think I do not want you caught in the middle of something that could turn ugly. We are already in the middle of it. You brought us in. You did not ask for us, but you did not turn us away. Do not push us out now." Silas met her eyes. Something moved behind them. Not quite fear, not quite hope. Something between duty and doubt. "I would not change what I did," he said. "Then do not undo it." The rain started then, soft at first, tapping the windows. He stood still, caught in something he could not name. But in her voice there was no fear, just fire, the same quiet fire he had seen in her that first day when she was half dead in the snow and still walking. He realized then that he did not want to go back to a house without her in it. Not the cooking or the cleaning or the children's voices, her, the way she stood, the way she looked at a problem and did not flinch, the way she made this place feel like something other than a punishment. "I am not sending you anywhere," he said finally. Clara exhaled, and something in the room shifted. Something settled into place like a stone finding the bottom of a river. Whatever came, they would face it together. Harlan Cobb arrived 3 days early. He rode in just after first light on a Tuesday morning, coming up the main road from the south with the posture of a man who had never questioned his right to anything. Clean-shaven, coat pressed, eyes that did not blink. He had the spine of a lawyer and the face of a preacher, the kind of man who could smile while sliding a knife between your ribs and make you think it was a kindness. But he did not come alone. Behind him rode a man on a black horse, thin, sharp-featured, wearing a wool coat too fine for the territory. This was Emmett Graves, attorney at law, and behind Graves came 2 more riders. The first was Jed Farley, broad-shouldered, with a scar running from his left ear to his jaw, the kind of man whose size announced his purpose before he opened his mouth. The second was a silent figure called Boone, who had a 6-shooter on his hip and eyes that moved like a hawk scanning a field. Harlan looked at the ranch house the way a man looks at something he has already purchased. He did not see Clara hanging wash behind the shed, did not notice the children feeding hens in the yard. He saw fences and timber and pasture, saw cattle fat from a good winter, saw value. Silas met him at the gate, hands loose at his sides, hat low. He said nothing. I came civil. Harlan said from his saddle, do not plan on changing that, but I aim to claim what is mine. He produced a leather satchel and pulled from it a set of documents. The deed was old, the paper yellowed and soft at the folds, but it was not obviously fake. Harlan Cobb, it turned out, was a cousin of the late wife of Silas's brother Eli. The land had been signed over during the final days of the woman's illness. Her signature was barely legible, shaky and thin, the writing of someone whose hands were failing. But it looked legal enough. Eli had never filed a correction. Grief had made him careless, the kind of carelessness that lets snakes in through the cracks. Silas studied the papers with a face like stone. He said nothing for a long time. Then Harlan added something else. His eyes drifted toward the house and a cold smile crossed his lips. I also hear you have a mail-order bride living here. A marriage arrangement not yet completed, carries no property rights. She has no voice in this matter. Legally, she is a guest. Clara stood in the doorway. She heard every word. Her hand gripped the edge of her apron until the fabric bit into her palm. She did not step outside, not yet. This was not the moment, but she memorized everything. Every word, every face, every detail of the men on their horses and the lawyer with his satchel, and the way Harlan looked at the land with calculating eyes instead of loving ones. Take your time, Harlan said, gathering the reins. I'm staying at Carson's place in town. I will be back on Sunday. He turned his horse and rode out the way he came. Quiet, sure, with the air of a man who had already made peace with winning. That night, Rosie's fever came back. It came sudden and violent, the way storms come in the mountains. 1 hour, the child was sleeping peacefully, the next her body was burning. Her skin was so hot that Clara jerked her hand back the first time she touched it. The cough that had lingered for weeks turned sharp and deep and wet, each one shaking Rosie's tiny frame like a rag being wrung out. Clara held her through the night, wet cloths on the forehead, whispered prayers that came out cracked and thin. Rosie's breathing grew shallow. Each inhale was a small war, a rattling, wheezing sound that filled the room with dread. Silas saddled his horse at 3 in the morning and rode to town through the dark to fetch Dr. Mercer. The cold was brutal. Stars burned overhead like chips of ice. He rode hard and did not stop. The doctor came at dawn, a tired man in his 50s with kind eyes and cautious hands. He examined Rosie in the dim light of the bedroom, while Clara stood behind him, arms crossed tight against her chest, holding herself together by force. Mercer pulled her aside. His voice was low. Pneumonia. In a child this small, I cannot make promises. Keep her warm. Give her the tonic every 4 hours. And pray. Clara did not cry. She walked back into the room, rolled up her sleeves, and began to fight. She boiled water for compresses. She stoked the fire until the room was almost too hot to breathe in. She held Rosie against her chest and rocked her slow and steady hour after hour, as if the rhythm of her body alone could keep the child alive. Nettie sat beside her sister's bed with a face white as paper. Mama, will Rosie be all right? Clara looked at her daughter, the oldest, the one who had carried more than any child should, the one who had not complained since the day her father died. I will not let her go, Clara said. Her voice did not shake. It was sharp and certain, the voice of a woman who had already decided that death would not win this one. Not here, not in this house, not while she had breath and hands and will. For 5 days, Rosie hung between living and dying. Clara barely slept. She ate standing up if she ate at all. Her eyes went hollow, her cheeks thinned, but she did not stop. She changed the compresses every hour. She measured the tonic with trembling hands. She whispered to Rosie in the dark stories about spring and flowers and a pony that Rosie would ride someday if she would just hold on a little longer. Silas took shifts beside her. He kept the fire burning, heated water, brought food that Clara did not touch. He did not speak much during those days, but his presence was steady, a constant weight that held the room together. One night near the worst of it, when Rosie's breathing had grown so faint that Clara had to press her ear to the baby's chest to hear it, she nearly broke. She sat on the edge of the bed, hands in her lap, eyes staring at nothing. Her whole body was shaking, not from cold, from the sheer crushing weight of it all. The dead husband, the lost home, the long road, the frozen ground, and now this, her baby, her last born, the one she had carried through snow and hunger and fear, only to lose her in a warm room beside a fire that would not go out. Silas came in and sat beside her. He did not touch her at first, just sat there solid and quiet like a fence post in a storm. Then he said very softly, "You are not alone anymore." Clara looked at him. Her eyes were red, swollen, old with exhaustion. For the first time since she arrived at this ranch, she leaned her head against his shoulder. He did not move. He just stayed. And that was everything. In town, word reached Ida Pratchett that the baby was sick. She received it the way she received most things, as confirmation of her own predictions. "I told them," she said to anyone who would listen, "bringing sickness to our town. Next, it will be the school children, mark my words." But Agnes Harper did not listen. She packed a bundle of herbal medicine, the kind her grandmother used to make from wild sage and dried elderflower, and rode out to the ranch herself. She did not mention the gossip. She set the bundle on the kitchen table and said, "This saved my grandson 10 years ago." Then she sat with Clara through the night and helped her change the compresses and never once asked for thanks. On the 8th day, Rosie's fever broke. It happened in the early morning, just as light was coming through the window. Clara was holding the baby against her chest, half asleep when she felt it. A change in the skin, a coolness where there had been fire. Rosie stirred, opened her eyes, and for the first time in more than a week she cried. Not the weak, fading cry of illness, but a real full-throated, hungry cry. The cry of a child who wanted milk and warmth and her mother's face. Clara wept. She held Rosie and wept with a sound that came from somewhere deeper than grief, deeper than relief. It came from the place where a mother stores the fear she cannot show, the terror she swallows every night so her children will not see it. She wept until there was nothing left, and then she kissed Rosie's forehead and whispered, "You are still here. You are still here." Dr. Mercer came that afternoon and examined the baby. He listened to her chest and looked in her throat and then sat back with something close to wonder on his tired face. "She is stronger than I thought," he said. Like her mother. While Rosie healed, Nettie changed. She had watched Silas for weeks with careful, suspicious eyes. The eyes of a child who had learned that men leave, that men get sick and die, and that the women left behind are the ones who dig the holes and carry the weight. She had measured Silas against every fear she carried and found him wanting, not because he was cruel, but because he might leave. But during those 5 nights, she saw something different. She saw Silas sit up until 2 in the morning, boiling water for compresses. Saw him carry firewood in the dark so Clara would not have to leave Rosie's side. Saw him clean the kitchen without being asked, wash the dishes, sweep the floor, do the work that was not his because it needed doing. She saw him hold the lantern steady while Clara measured medicine, his hand not shaking once. On the morning after Rosie's fever broke, Nettie placed something on the table in front of Silas. A small wildflower, dried and slightly bent, that she had found pressed between the pages of a book. She did not say a word, just set it down and stood there looking at him with eyes that were not suspicious anymore. Silas looked at the flower. Then he looked at Nettie, and he nodded once. That was all. But it was everything. While Clara had been fighting for Rosie's life, Harlan Cobb had not been idle. Emmett Graves went to town and met with Judge Thornton at the county courthouse. He filed the claim formally. Papers stamped, dates recorded. The machinery of law set into motion with the cold efficiency of men who understood that justice was more often than not a matter of paperwork. Jed Farley made his own rounds. He visited the blacksmith who shod Silas's horses. He visited the feed supplier who sold Silas grain. He visited the men Silas did business with and said nothing directly. But the implication was clear. When Harlan Cobb owns this land, he will remember who stood with him and who did not. Ida Pratchett saw her chance. She went to her husband, the banker, and suggested he stop extending credit to Silas for the spring planting. It was only prudent, she said, with the legal situation being what it was. The banker, who feared his wife more than he feared God, agreed. And then the worst of it came. Tom Briggs, owner of the farm supply store, a man Silas had considered a friend, A man whose roof Silas had patched 2 winters ago, when the weight of snow caved in the east side, signed a paper swearing that Harlan Cobb's claim to the land was legitimate. He did not do it willingly. Harlan held an old debt over Briggs, a note from a failed business deal years back, and Graves had made it clear that the debt would be called in full if Briggs did not cooperate. Silas heard about it while feeding the cattle. He stood very still for a long moment. Then he picked up the shovel, leaning against the barn wall, and threw it with enough force to crack the wood siding. He did not come inside that night. Clara found him sitting on the top rail of the fence, looking out at nothing. The darkness was total. Not even stars. 5 years I fixed their fences and patched their roofs, he said. His voice was bitter and flat. And this is what it comes to. Clara stood beside him and did not touch him. She let the silence hold them for a while. Then she said, "We are not going to let them win." He did not answer. The next morning, with Rosie sleeping peacefully for the first time in days, Clara sat down at the kitchen table and spread out the papers Harlan had left behind. She read every word, slowly, carefully, running her finger along each line, sounding out the legal language the way she had once sounded out words in her mother's Bible. She was not a lawyer. She had no training, no education beyond the schoolhouse she attended until she was 14. But she was a woman who had lost a home once because she had not read the fine print, because she had trusted a banker with smooth hands, because she had believed that someone else would protect her. She would not make that mistake again. The deed listed a notary, J. Putnam. The signature was there at the bottom of the page, firm and clear, dated September of 1873. Clara wrote the name on a scrap of paper and put it in her pocket. She looked at Silas across the table. He was staring at his coffee. She could see the defeat in his shoulders, the way he was already bracing for the blow. "Do not think about losing," she said. "Think about who can help." He shook his head. "I have never asked for favors." Clara leaned forward. Her voice was soft, but the words had edges. "You are not asking. You are reminding them what is at stake. This ranch feeds half the town through winter. You have patched their roofs, fixed their wagons, delivered calves in their darkest hours. They know what kind of man you are. Let them speak." Silas looked at her the way a man looks at something he has just realized he has been seeing wrong his whole life. Not just the widow with the baby and the broken wagon. The woman who still carried weight in her voice, who had seen enough loss to know what was worth fighting for. Clara rode to town alone the next day. She went to Agnes Harper first. She stood in the back of the general store and asked as calmly as she could manage about J. Putnam. Agnes frowned. "Putnam? He has been dead 7 years, passed before Eli's wife even took sick." Clara felt her heart quicken, but she kept her face still. If Putnam died in March of 1871, and the deed was dated September of 1873, then whoever signed that document as notary was not J. Putnam. The signature was forged. She did not say this aloud. Not yet. She needed proof. She needed certainty. She had learned that much from losing the first time. You do not accuse a man with lawyers and hired muscle unless you are standing on solid ground. She asked Agnes to search the old records for Putnam's date of death. Agnes looked at her for a long moment, reading something in Clara's face that she did not need explained. "I will find it," Agnes said. Clara thanked her and left. Her mind was moving fast now, faster than it had moved in months, pieces clicking together, like the parts of a machine she was building blind. She was not just rallying sympathy anymore. She was building a case. She rode back to the ranch with the wind at her back and the first real feeling of hope she had felt since the letter came. But she also carried something else. A piece of information Agnes had shared in passing, almost as an afterthought, while Clara was putting on her coat. "You should know," Agnes said, "the Union Pacific Railroad has been surveying a new line through this valley. If that line goes through, every acre of land between here and the mountains will be worth 10 times what it is now." Clara stopped with her hand on the door. She looked at Agnes. "Harlan Cobb does not want this ranch," Agnes said. "He wants to sell it." Clara rode home in silence. She now knew 2 things that Harlan did not know she knew. The notary was dead before the deed was signed, and the land was worth a fortune to the railroad. She did not play her cards yet. She kept them close, like a woman who has learned that the right information delivered at the right time is worth more than a loaded gun. On Sunday, Harlan returned, confident, satisfied. He had Briggs's testimony. He had his lawyer. He had papers filed with the court. Silas met him outside the barn, papers in hand. Clara stood in the doorway with flour on her apron and her pulse running low and steady like distant thunder. It is valid, Silas said of the deed, but you and I both know what this place is worth. If you want money, say it plain. Harlan dismounted, loosened his gloves. I want the land. My father broke horses on this soil. My mother is buried not 10 miles from here. You have had your run, cousin. Now it is mine. Clara stepped out. It was the first time she had faced Harlan directly. She walked down the porch steps and stood beside Silas, arms at her sides, shoulders square. Mr. Cobb, she said, if you truly love this land, you would want it cared for. Why bring a lawyer and hired men instead of coming to talk? Harlan looked at her. The smile dropped from his face. It was replaced by something colder, harder. Who are you to speak? You are not a legal wife. You are a guest, a boarder, a woman who arrived with nothing and has nothing. Clara did not blink, did not step back, did not lower her voice. I am the woman who walked 20 miles through a blizzard pulling 4 children in a broken wagon. I did not come this far to be told I do not matter. I am not a guest, Mr. Cobb. I am a woman who does not quit. Harlan's expression did not change, but something shifted behind his eyes. He had underestimated her. He realized it in that moment, and he did not like it. He turned his horse without tipping his hat, rode off slower than before. Clara watched him go and knew she had just made an enemy, a real one, the kind that does not forget and does not forgive. The days that followed were a race, a quiet, desperate race between what Clara could build and what Harlan could tear down. She rode to town again and again. She spoke with Agnes, with the school teacher, Miss Linden, with Old Man Haskell, the blacksmith who had made Putnam's coffin and nailed the lid shut. Clem Dawson found her at the general store one afternoon. She looked him straight in the eye. You said I would not last the first winter. I am still standing. Winter is almost over. Dawson looked at her. He remembered the blizzard, the calf, the woman on her knees in the mud with blood on her hands and no hesitation in her eyes. You are still standing, he said. I was wrong. He took off his hat and held it against his chest. If you need me in front of the judge, I will be there. Clara nodded once. Thank you. Tom Briggs came to her in the dark of a Tuesday evening. He knocked on the ranch house door with his hat in his hands and shame written across his face like a brand. I signed it because Harlan threatened to call him my dead, he said. His voice was thin and reedy, but I did not know the deed was forged. If you need me, I will say so in court. Clara looked at him for a long time. The man who had betrayed Silas. The man whose roof Silas had fixed in the snow. She could have turned him away. Could have told him that loyalty shown only when it is convenient is not loyalty at all. But Clara was not interested in punishing people. She was interested in winning. Be there on time, she said, and closed the door. On the porch that evening, after the wagons of the first few supporters had come and gone, Silas and Clara sat on the steps watching the sky turn to lavender and ash. The air smelled of wet earth and new grass. Somewhere inside, the children were playing a game with buttons and string. Their laughter floated through the open window light, and bright and impossible to fake. You did not have to do all that, Silas said. Clara did not look at him. She watched the windmill turn slow and sure. Neither did they. He was quiet for a long while. Then I forgot that people remember. They do, she said. Sometimes they just need reminding. Silas rubbed the back of his neck. Then he turned toward her. Full on. The porch light flickered just enough to catch the curve of her cheek, the soft hollow beneath her throat. She wore no jewelry. Her hands were rough. Her hair had come loose from the braid and curled at her temple. He had never seen anything so plain or so beautiful. I have been thinking, he said, about the house, about you, about the children. The way he said it, slow and with space between the words, told her this was not something light. I do not want to overstep, he continued, but this place feels different with you here. Better, like it is whole again. She did not speak, not right away. She let the weight of his words settle. Her throat tightened. She had been waiting to hear something like that for longer than she cared to admit. But she had also learned to be cautious with men who spoke kindly when the wind was right. And if the wind turns, it will, he said. It always does. But I do not blow over easy, and I reckon neither do you. Her eyes searched his, not for charm, not for comfort, for truth. She found it. I will not marry again for safety, she said. I would rather stand in the storm alone. I am not offering safety, he said. I am offering myself. It was such a simple thing. No ring, no kneeling, just a man, honest and tired and open, sitting on a porch step in the fading light, saying the truest thing he knew how to say. Clara reached out and laid her fingers over his. The calluses met. I do not need saving, she whispered. I know, he said, but I still want to stand beside you. They sat that way until the stars came out, one by one, quiet and sure in the great open sky. And for the first time in years, Clara let herself believe that this might be home. But Harlan Cobb was not finished. The blows came fast, one after another, like punches thrown by a man who knew the fight was heading to the judges and wanted to make sure his opponent could barely stand when he got there. First, the court filing. Graves had submitted everything to Judge Thornton. The hearing was set for 2 weeks out. The paperwork was thorough, organized, airtight on the surface. Second, Jed Farley visited Dr. Mercer. The visit lasted 10 minutes. No one saw what happened inside, but when Mercer emerged, his face was gray and his hands were shaking. He told Agnes Harper that he would not be testifying for anyone in any matter related to the Drummond Ranch. He would not say why. But Agnes noticed that the window on the east side of his office had been cracked and there was a boot print on the floor that did not match any shoe the doctor owned. Third and worst came what happened on the road. Clara was riding back from town alone. It was late afternoon, the light going orange and thin through the bare trees along the creek road. She had been to the clerk's office to check on Putnam's death record. She had found it. March 1871. 2.5 years before the deed was dated. She was carrying the proof in her saddlebag when she heard the hooves behind her. Jed Farley came alongside her on a gray mare, riding slow, taking his time. He smiled, and it was the kind of smile that had nothing to do with friendliness. Mrs. Whitfield, or should I say Mrs. Drummond. Oh wait, not married yet. Clara kept her eyes forward. Her hands were steady on the reins, but her heart was beating so hard she could hear it in her ears. Farley leaned in. His voice dropped. Harlan asked me to pass along a message. Let it go. The ranch is not yours. Take the children somewhere else. Better for everyone. Clara turned and looked him directly in the eyes. Hers were calm. His were not. You tell Harlan Cobb that I have lost a home once before. I know exactly what that feels like. And I know that I will not let it happen again. Farley's smile faded. His eyes went flat. He straightened in his saddle and looked down at her with something that might have been respect, or might have been the careful assessment of a man who was recalculating how much force would be needed. Careful on the dark roads, Mrs. Whitfield, he said. Then he turned his horse and rode away. Clara rode the rest of the way home with her hands trembling on the reins. She did not tell Silas about the encounter, not because she was weak, but because she knew him. She knew that if she told him, he would reach for a rifle. And violence was exactly what Harlan wanted. It would give him cause, give the judge reason to doubt Silas's character, give the lawyer ammunition. She swallowed the fear. She buried it in flour and fire and the steady rhythm of kneading bread. And she kept going. Fourth, Ida Pratchett circulated a petition. She gathered 4 signatures from neighbors willing to state in writing that Silas Drummond had occupied the land improperly. 4 was not many, but it was enough to add weight to Harlan's claim. Enough to make the judge pause. That evening, Clara sat alone in the kitchen after the children were in bed. The house was dark except for the low glow of the stove. Rosie was finally sleeping peacefully. The boys were warm and safe. Nettie had fallen asleep with a book open on her chest. Everything Clara had fought for was about to be taken away. Again. She looked at her hands in the dim light. Raw. Red. Scarred from frozen ground and hot stoves and rains that cut into the skin. These hands had dug a grave, had pulled a wagon, had delivered a calf in a blizzard, had held a dying baby for 5 days and 5 nights and refused to let go. And now these hands might not be enough. She whispered into the darkness so quiet that only the walls could hear. I am sorry we are such a burden. She did not know Silas was standing in the doorway. She did not hear him come in. He was there in the shadow and he had heard her. He crossed the room, sat down across from her, took her hands in his. Listen to me, he said. His voice was low and rough, the voice of a man who did not waste words. I lived in this house for 5 years alone, and called it living. That was not living. That was waiting to die. You and these children brought life back into this place. You are not a burden. He held her hands tighter. You are meant to be here. Clara looked up at him. Her eyes were wet, her lips pressed tight against the sobs she would not let escape. He did not look away. He held her gaze with the steadiness of a man who had finally found something worth holding on to and would not let it slip. Outside, the wind pressed against the windows. Inside, the stove ticked as the metal cooled. The children slept in the next room, breathing in the slow rhythm of safety, a rhythm they had not known since before their father died. Clara thought about what it had cost her to get here. The grave she dug, the road she walked, the doors that closed, the voices that told her she was nothing, a burden, a mouth to feed, a problem to be managed. She had started to believe them. Somewhere between Nebraska and this kitchen table, she had started to believe that she was the weight and not the anchor. But this man, this quiet, broken, stubborn man, was telling her otherwise. And he meant it. She could see that he meant it the way she could see that winter was ending. Not all at once, but in small signs. In the way he looked at her children. In the way he said their names. Now listen, he said. We are going to fight this, you and me. You found something about that deed. I can see it in your face. Tell me. Clara breathed in deep. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. The notary on the deed, she said. J. Putnam. He died in March of 1871. The deed is dated September of 1873. That is 2.5 years after Putnam was buried. Silas stared at her. The signature is forged, Clara said, and I think I know who forged it. She pulled the papers from her apron. The death certificate she had copied from the clerk's office. The dates, the names, everything lined up point by point like stitches in a seam. We need 3 things, she said. A witness who can confirm Putnam's death, someone who can prove the handwriting does not match, and someone who will tell the court that Harlan threatened them into supporting a lie. She looked at Silas across the table. The lamp between them threw a small circle of gold onto the wood. I have all 3, she said. Silas looked at her for a long time, and for the first time in 5 years, the guilt in his eyes was replaced by something else. Hope. Outside, the wind had shifted. It was blowing from the west now, carrying the faint smell of thaw. The first sign that winter was loosening its grip, that something new was coming. Clara felt it through the walls. She stood up, put the papers back in her apron, and looked at the man across from her. The man who had carried her children out of the snow. The man who had given up his bed without a word. The man who had sat beside her through 5 nights of fever and never once told her it would be all right because he respected her too much to lie. Get some sleep, she said. We ride to town in the morning. And she went to bed knowing that tomorrow the real fight would begin. Clara rode to the county clerk's office before the sun was fully up. The building sat at the end of Elk Crossing's main street, a squat wooden structure with a tin roof and a door that stuck in the frame. The clerk was a thin man named Pemberton who wore spectacles on the tip of his nose and smelled of ink and old paper. He looked up when Clara walked in and said nothing, just watched her the way a man watches someone who clearly has business that will take a while. I need to see the death records for the year 1871, Clara said. Specifically March. Pemberton blinked. He pulled a ledger from the shelf behind him, thick with dust, and set it on the counter. He opened it to March and stepped aside. Clara ran her finger down the page. Name after name written in the careful hand of whoever had been clerk back then. Fever, accident, childbirth, the small brutal catalog of frontier dying. And then halfway down the page for March 14th, she found it. Putnam James R. died. March 14th, 1871. Cause of death, heart failure. Witnessed by E. Haskell Blacksmith. She copied the entry onto a piece of paper. Every word, every date. Then she turned to the next page and the next, confirming there was no other Putnam. No son, no brother, no cousin. James R. Putnam was the only one, and he had been dead for 2.5 years before his name appeared on Harlan Cobb's deed. Clara folded the paper carefully and put it in the inside pocket of her coat. Then she asked Pemberton for one more thing. I need to see any documents filed by an attorney named Emmett Graves. Anything with his handwriting. Pemberton gave her a long look. Then he shrugged and pulled another box from under the counter. Property filings mostly. Motions and claims written in a sharp slanting hand. Clara held one of them up beside the deed. She was not an expert in handwriting, not by any measure. But even she could see the similarities. The way the capital P leaned to the right. The way the T was crossed with a long horizontal stroke. The way the letters bunched together in the middle of words and spread apart at the ends. She did not need to be an expert. She just needed to give the judge reason to look closer. She thanked Pemberton and left. The morning air was cold and clean, and her breath made small clouds as she walked to her horse. Her hands were steady. Her mind was clear. For the first time since the letter arrived, she felt like she was standing on solid ground instead of sinking through it. Over the next 3 days, Clara built her case the way a carpenter builds a house. One beam at a time, one nail at a time. Nothing left loose. Nothing left to chance. She visited old man Haskell at the blacksmith shop. He was working the forge when she came in, his face lit orange by the coals, his arms streaked with soot. He was the kind of man who measured his words the way he measured iron, carefully and without waste. "Mr. Haskell," Clara said, "you made the coffin for James Putnam in 1871. Do you remember Haskell set down his hammer?" He wiped his hands on his apron and looked at her with eyes that had seen 60 years of frontier life and were surprised by very little. "I remember," he said, "pine box. Brass handles from his own dresser because his wife wanted something nice and there was nothing else to use. I nailed the lid myself, March of 71. Cold spring that year." Would you say that in front of a judge, Haskell looked at her for a long time? Then he nodded. "I would." Next, she went to Miss Linden, the schoolteacher, a young woman with ink-stained fingers and a serious face, who kept meticulous records of the school board meetings going back 15 years. Putnam had been a member of the school board before his death. His signature appeared on dozens of documents, clear and consistent. Miss Linden laid 3 of them on her desk beside a copy of the signature on the deed. Even at a glance, the difference was obvious. Putnam's real signature was small and compact. The letters rounded the P, modest and upright. The signature on the deed was larger, sharper, with that distinctive rightward lean that matched Emmett Graves's hand. "These are not the same person's writing," Miss Linden said. "I am not a handwriting expert, but I have taught penmanship for 12 years, and I would stake my reputation on that." "Will you say so in court?" Miss Linden straightened her back. "I will." The last piece came from Clem Dawson. Clara found him mending fence along the creek road. He saw her coming and leaned on the post, waiting. "I need you to tell me something honestly," Clara said. "Have you heard anything about the railroad surveying this valley?" Dawson spat into the dirt and nodded. "Union Pacific men came through last autumn. Talked to a few landowners on the quiet. Word is they are looking at a route through the gap south of Silas's place. If it goes through, every acre in this valley goes from cattle land to gold. And Harlan Cobb knows this." Dawson looked at her. "Everybody with half an ear to the ground knows it. That is why Cobb wants the deed settled fast. He does not want to ranch that land. He wants to sell it before the railroad even lays the first rail. Buy low, sell high. Oldest trick there is." Clara had everything she needed. 3 witnesses, documentary proof, and a motive that would strip away every word Harlan had said about family heritage and his father's horses and his mother's grave. She rode home with the wind behind her and the papers in her saddlebag, and a feeling in her chest that was not quite confidence but was no longer despair. It was something in between. The feeling of a woman who has been knocked down so many times that getting up is no longer courage. It is simply what she does. Agnes Harper paid a visit to Dr. Mercer's office the evening before the hearing. No one heard what she said to him through the closed door. But when she left, Mercer was standing in his doorway with his coat already on and his medical bag in his hand. Whatever Agnes had said, it was enough. The next morning, he was in the courtroom. The hearing was set for a Thursday morning. The night before, Clara could not sleep. She sat at the kitchen table with all her papers spread before her, going over each point one more time. Death certificate, school board signatures, the dates that did not add up, the handwriting that did not match, Tom Briggs's testimony about being coerced, the railroad survey that explained everything Harlan claimed to feel about the land. Silas came in and sat across from her. He did not speak for a while, just watched her work, the way she moved the papers, the way her lips moved slightly as she rehearsed the words she would say. You know they will not make it easy, he said. Clara looked up. I know. Graves is a sharp man. He will try to twist everything. Let him try. Silas leaned forward. His face was serious, but something else was there too. Something that looked almost like pride. I want you to know, he said, whatever happens tomorrow, whatever the judge decides, you have already done more for this place than I ever did. Clara shook her head. That is not true. It is true. I sat in this house for 5 years feeling sorry for myself. You walked in half frozen and started fighting from day one. That is the difference between us. I was waiting for something to end. You were looking for something to begin. Clara did not answer right away. She folded one of the papers and set it on top of the stack. Then she said very quietly, we should get some sleep. But neither of them did, not really. The courthouse in Elk Crossing was not much to look at. A wooden building with a pitched roof and windows that rattled when the wind picked up. The courtroom itself was a single room with wooden benches on both sides of an aisle and a raised desk at the front, where Judge Thornton sat with his spectacles low on his nose and his expression giving away nothing. The room was full, not just the people Clara had spoken to, but others. Neighbors who had heard through Agnes Harper and Clem Dawson and the quiet network of small-town talk that something important was happening. Farmers in their best coats, wives with their hair pinned back, a few children who had been told to sit still and were doing their best. The air smelled of wood polish and boot leather and the particular tension that fills a room when people know that what happens in the next hour will change things. Harlan Cobb sat on the left side of the courtroom with Emmett Graves beside him. Harlan was dressed well, clean collar, polished boots. His face wore the calm expression of a man who believed the outcome was already decided. Graves sat with a leather folder open on the bench beside him, papers organized, pen ready. Jed Farley sat in the back row. Boone was not there. Silas and Clara sat on the right side. Clara wore the best dress she owned, which was not very good, but was clean and pressed. Her hair was braided tight. Her hands were folded in her lap. She looked calm. She did not feel calm, but she had learned long ago that what you feel and what you show are two different things, and the one you control is the one that matters. Behind them sat Agnes Harper, Clem Dawson, Old Man Haskell the blacksmith, Miss Linden with a folder of her own, Tom Briggs sitting near the back with his hat in his hands and his eyes on the floor, Dr. Mercer, who had taken a seat near the door with his hands folded and his jaw set, and beside Mercer, a dozen other people from town and the surrounding ranches, people who had come not because Clara asked, but because Agnes Harper had spent 3 days walking from door to door saying one thing. You know Silas Drummond? You know what kind of man he is. Come and stand for him. Judge Thornton called the room to order. Emmett Graves spoke first. He was good. Clara had to admit that. He stood with one hand on his lapel and the other holding a sheaf of papers, and he spoke in a voice that was measured and certain and threaded with the authority of a man who had studied law and practiced it in places where courtrooms were made of marble instead of pine. He presented the deed. He presented Harlan Cobb's lineage, the family connection to Eli Drummond's wife. He presented the chain of ownership as he understood it. He noted that Silas Drummond had never formally filed for title to the land after his brother's death, had simply continued to occupy it, which was Graves said a common but legally insufficient practice. He noted that the marriage arrangement between Silas and Clara was incomplete and therefore conferred no property rights on Clara. He was thorough. He was precise. He made it sound like the simplest thing in the world. A man had a deed, another man did not. The law was clear. When Graves sat down, the room was very quiet. Clara could feel the weight of his argument pressing on everyone. The neighbors who had come to show support looked uncertain now. The law was the law, and Graves had made it sound unassailable. Judge Thornton looked to the other side of the room. Mr. Drummond, do you have a response? Silas started to rise, but Clara put her hand on his arm. She looked at him, he looked at her. Something passed between them without words. Then Silas sat back down and Clara stood up. A murmur went through the room. Graves raised an eyebrow. Harlan shifted in his seat. Judge Thornton looked at Clara over his spectacles. And you are Clara Whitfield, she said. I am the mail-order bride Mr. Graves mentioned. I have no legal standing in this matter, as he correctly pointed out. I am not a lawyer. I am not a wife, at least not yet. I am a widow with 4 children who arrived at this ranch half dead in the snow. but I have something to show the court if you will allow it. Thornton studied her for a moment. Then he nodded. Proceed. Clara took a breath. She opened the folder she had been carrying against her chest and began. Your Honor, the deed Mr. Graves has presented is dated September of 1873. The notary listed on that deed is one James R. Putnam. She held up the paper she had copied from the clerk's office. James R. Putnam died on March 14, 1871, 2.5 years before this deed was supposedly notarized. I have his death certificate right here copied from the county records. The room went still, completely, absolutely still. The kind of silence that has weight. Clara continued. Mr. Haskell, the blacksmith here in Elk Crossing, built Mr. Putnam's coffin and nailed the lid himself in March of 1871. He is here today and can confirm this. Old man Haskell stood up from his bench. He did not speak. He did not need to. He just stood there solid as the anvil he worked on every day, and his presence said everything. Furthermore, Clara said, I have compared the signature of J. Putnam on this deed with authentic samples of Mr. Putnam's handwriting from the school board records, which Miss Linden has brought today. The signatures do not match. The handwriting on the deed is significantly different from Mr. Putnam's known writing. Miss Linden stood and held up her folder. She did not speak either, but she was there, and the folder was there, and the truth was there. Clara turned to look at Harlan Cobb. He was not smiling anymore. His face had gone the color of old plaster. Graves was leaning toward him, whispering something, but Harlan was not listening. He was looking at Clara, and in his eyes was the slow, terrible recognition of a man who has been outmaneuvered by someone he never considered a threat. There is more, Clara said. She turned back to the judge. Mr. Tom Briggs, who signed a statement supporting Mr. Cobb's claim, is here today. He will tell the court that he was coerced into signing that statement. Mr. Cobb held an old debt over him and threatened to call it in if he did not cooperate. Mr. Briggs never saw the original deed and had no independent knowledge of its validity. Tom Briggs stood up. His face was white and his hands were shaking, but he stood. He looked at Harlan and then at the judge and said in a voice that cracked but did not break, "That is the truth." The whisper that went through the courtroom was like wind through grass. Every head turned, every eye moved between Harlan and Briggs, and Clara trying to understand what was happening, trying to map the shape of a lie that had just been turned inside out. But Clara was not finished. She had one more card, the one she had held closest, the one she had not even told Silas about because she wanted it to land clean and hard and unexpected. Your Honor, she said, I would like to address one more point. Mr. Cobb has told this court that he wants this land because of his family's connection to it, that his father broke horses on this soil, that his mother is buried nearby. These are beautiful sentiments. She paused. Let the silence build, but they are not the reason he is here. She looked directly at Harlan. He stared back at her, his jaw tight, the tendons in his neck standing out like rope. The Union Pacific Railroad is currently surveying a new line through this valley, Clara said. If that line is approved, every acre of land between here and the mountains will be worth 10 times its current value. Mr. Cobb is not here to ranch this land. He is not here to honor his family. He is here to acquire a piece of property at the cost of a forged deed and sell it to the railroad for a fortune. The room erupted, not into shouting, but into the thick rolling sound of 24 people all speaking at once. Hands went up. Heads shook. Someone in the back said, I knew it. Judge Thornton brought his gavel down twice hard and the noise subsided. Harlan Cobb was on his feet. His composure was gone. His face was red and twisted. The smooth mask finally cracked to show what was underneath. She has no right, he shouted. She is not a party to this case. She is a nobody, a mail-order bride with no name and no standing. Judge Thornton looked at him over his spectacles with the slow, steady gaze of a man who has been on the bench long enough to recognize desperation when he sees it. Sit down, Mr. Cobb. Harlan stood there for a moment, breathing hard. Graves pulled at his sleeve. Finally, Harlan sat. Thornton looked at Clara. He looked at the papers in her hand. He looked at the people standing in the courtroom, the blacksmith and the school teacher, and the rancher, and the doctor, and the neighbors who had come in their clean clothes and their scuffed boots to stand for something. Then he spoke. I have heard enough to raise serious questions about the validity of this deed. The evidence of a deceased notary, the handwriting discrepancies, and the testimony of a coerced witness constitute sufficient grounds for a full investigation. Mr. Cobb, Mr. Graves, I am ordering you to remain in this county until a formal ruling is issued. I am also referring the matter of possible document fraud to the territorial prosecutor. He paused and looked at Harlan Cobb one more time. If this deed is found to be forged, Mr. Cobb, you will face criminal charges. Do you understand? Harlan said nothing. He sat in his chair like a man whose bones had turned to water. Clara stood still. She did not smile, did not celebrate. She just stood there with her papers in her hand and her shoulders set and her heart beating so hard that she could feel it in her teeth. She had done what she came to do, not with a gun, not with a man's voice or a man's authority, with truth and patience and the stubborn refusal to be dismissed. She looked at Silas. He was watching her. His eyes were bright, not with tears but with something just as powerful. He gave her the smallest nod. Behind them, one by one, the people in the courtroom began to stand. Agnes Harper, first pushing herself up with a hand on the bench in front of her, her old knees protesting but her back straight. Then Clem Dawson. Then Haskell the blacksmith. Then Miss Linden. Then Dr. Mercer, who stood near the door with his hands in his pockets and something on his face that might have been relief or might have been shame for having almost stayed away. Then others, one by one. Not cheering, not clapping, just standing. The way you stand when you want to be counted. Harlan Cobb looked at the room of standing people. He looked at the judge, he looked at Clara, and then he looked at the floor. Outside the courthouse, the air was cool and clean and smelled of spring. The sky was the color of washed linen, pale and soft. 7 wagons were parked by the hitching rail. Neighbors stood in small groups talking quietly the way people do when they have done something brave but are not sure what comes next. No one made speeches, no one patted backs, they just stayed. The way you do when you are making sure something does not fall apart once the pressure drops. Clara moved among them with coffee she had brought in a tin pot and bread she had baked that morning before dawn. Nothing fancy, just what she had. Her hands were steady, her voice was calm, but her heart was pounding so loud she could hear it in her ears. She had not expected them to come. Not really, she had hoped. But hope had been a scarce thing these past few years. To see it walking around on tired legs and old boots, that was something else entirely. Agnes Harper squeezed Clara's hand as she passed. You did well, girl. You did well. The formal ruling came 1 week later. Judge Thornton issued his decision from the bench on a Tuesday morning. The courtroom was half full this time. The people who mattered were there. The ones who were not had already heard through the grapevine what the outcome would be. The deed, Thornton said, had been determined to be fraudulent. The notary signature was forged, the dates were impossible, and the handwriting analysis supported by Miss Linden's testimony and the school board records confirmed that James R. Putnam had not signed the document. Furthermore, the testimony of Tom Briggs established that at least one supporting witness had been coerced. Harlan Cobb was formally charged with fraud and forgery of public records. Emmett Graves was referred to the Territorial Bar Association for disbarment proceedings. Jed Farley had disappeared from Elk Crossing 2 days before the ruling, riding out in the night without paying his bill at Carson's boarding house. No one went looking for him. Harlan was led from the courtroom in the custody of the county sheriff. He did not resist. He did not speak. He walked out with the blank, hollow expression of a man who had gambled everything on a single hand and lost. As the sheriff's wagon passed the road that led to Silas's ranch, Harlan looked out through the slats. He could see the house in the distance, low against the green hills, smoke rising straight from the chimney, the windmill turning slow and steady in the spring breeze. He looked at it with empty eyes. Then the wagon turned the corner and the ranch disappeared behind the trees. Ida Pratchett was not charged with anything. She had broken no laws. But in the weeks that followed, something shifted in the town's regard for her. People were polite to her face as they always had been, but the deference was gone. The authority she had assumed over the social life of Elk Crossing had been quietly revoked. Women who once sought her approval stopped asking for it. The church committees she had chaired for 8 years elected a new chairwoman. Her husband said nothing about any of it, which told her everything she needed to know. She never spoke about Clara Whitfield again. Not once, and Clara never mentioned her name either. Some victories do not need to be announced. They simply exist quiet and complete, like a fence that holds without anyone needing to test it. The land softened under April's sun, and with it, so did the edges of their lives. The days grew longer. The work was no less hard but lighter in the doing. Cows calved slick and steaming in the morning frost. Fences were mended. The creek ran fat and wild from the snowmelt, carrying with it the last of winter's weight. Each evening brought the smell of bread, the slap of dishwater, the sound of children out past supper running through the new grass. Clara found herself humming one morning while hanging laundry, an old hymn wordless now, just the tune. She had not sung since before Henry died. The sound startled her like it had come from someone else's throat. She stopped for a moment, hands still on the clothesline, and listened to the silence where the note had been. Then she started again. Louder this time, Rosie ran barefoot through the yard, dress catching the wind curls bouncing. Nettie chased after her, scolding without conviction. Daniel and Thomas were down by the creek trying to trap frogs with string and scraps of bread, a project that had produced no frogs but a great deal of laughter. Silas had started sleeping in the house again, in the spare room at first, then gradually closer. He did not push, did not ask for what had not been offered, but he was there every night, and that meant something. One evening after the children had gone to bed, Clara sat by the fire sewing a new hem into Rosie's dress. The child was growing faster than fabric could keep up with. Silas leaned against the mantel nearby, polishing a bridle. The scent of leather and wood smoke hung thick in the room. Had a thought, he said. Clara looked up. Dangerous. He smirked. The expression was so rare on his face that it almost looked borrowed. Could be. He set the bridle down and rubbed his hands together. We have a house. Hands to work it. Land. Come harvest, we will have enough put up for winter, and then some. He paused. I was thinking maybe we ought to make it official. Clara let the words sit a moment. She did not flinch, did not blush, just looked at him with steady eyes and a needle paused in fabric. You want to marry me, I do. Not because I feel I should, not to fix something broken, just because it feels right. Clara breathed in deep. Her chest ached not from pain, but from fullness, from the weight of everything she had carried and the lightness of this moment. She set the dress aside and stood, walked across the room, knelt in front of him and placed one hand on his knee. I have buried one husband, she said. I have begged for food. I have watched my children sleep hungry and prayed they would wake up. I am not a young woman anymore. I am not soft. I will not make easy company. Silas reached out and brushed a loose strand of hair from her face. You are exactly the company I want. That night she let him hold her. No urgency, no hunger, just hands that said, I am here and I am not going anywhere. She wept once softly into the hollow of his neck. He did not speak, just held her tighter. They married in the small church on the edge of Elk Crossing. It was a Saturday in late April. The sky was high and blue and the air smelled of wild sage and the particular sweetness that comes when the snow is finally gone from the mountains and the water runs clean. Neighbors stood shoulder to shoulder in the pews, boots cleaned but not polished. Agnes Harper sat in the front row with a handkerchief she never used because she was not the crying type, but had brought one just in case. Nettie wore a blue ribbon in her hair. She stood beside her mother at the altar, chin-up, hands folded, looking for all the world like a girl who had been carrying her family on her back and had finally set the weight down. Rosie carried a basket of wildflowers. She was healthy now, her cheeks pink, her eyes bright, and she walked down the aisle with the unsteady determination of a 2-year-old who knows she has an important job and intends to do it right. She dropped most of the flowers before she reached the front. Nobody minded. Daniel stood stiff in a jacket that was too big, borrowed from Agnes Harper's grandson. He had combed his own hair for the first time and it showed. Thomas stood beside him, silent as always, holding something behind his back. When the moment came, Thomas stepped forward and held out his gift to Silas. A small wooden horse carved with a pocket knife and sanded smooth with a piece of leather. It was crooked, and the legs were not quite even, and the mane looked more like a row of small teeth than hair. It was the most beautiful thing Silas had ever received. He knelt down and took the horse from the boy's hand, looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at Thomas. Thank you, he said. His voice was rough. Thomas nodded. Then for the first time since his father died, he put his arms around a man's neck and held on. There was no ring. Clara had not expected one and did not want one. Instead, Silas produced a single silver button, tarnished and slightly bent, sewn onto a length of rawhide. He had found it in the pocket of Eli's old coat, the one that hung in the back of the closet and had not been touched in 5 years. "It is not gold," he said as he tied it around her wrist, "but it is something that was worn and held close. Like us." Clara looked at the button on her wrist. She touched it with one finger. She did not cry. She smiled. Small and real and worth more than any ring. After the vows, they rode home together in the wagon, just the two of them. The children were staying with Agnes Harper for the night, the first time Clara had been separated from them since Henry's death. She had almost refused, but Agnes had insisted with the authority of a woman who had raised 6 children of her own and knew that a wedding night was not a time for explaining things to a 10-year-old. The road home was soft, the wheels barely made a sound. Silas held the reins with one hand and Clara's hand with the other, and neither of them spoke for most of the ride because there was nothing that needed saying. That night, in the hush of their shared room with the fire dying low and the sound of frogs calling from the creek bed, Clara lay beside her husband and stared at the ceiling. The same ceiling she had stared at the first night she arrived, when this place was not a promise but a pause. "I used to believe I was a burden," she whispered. Silas turned toward her. He kissed her temple, slow and sure, the way a man kisses something he intends to keep. "You are not a burden," he said. "You are meant to be here." And she believed him, for the first time, completely and without reservation. She believed him. The autumn came the way autumn comes to Montana, all at once and everywhere. The aspens turned gold overnight. The air sharpened. The hills went from green to amber to the deep rust color of old copper. The cattle were fat and the hay was stacked, and the root cellar was full of potatoes and turnips and the dried apples Clara had put up in August. The ranch had changed in the years since Clara arrived. There was a new room added to the house built by Silas and Daniel together over the summer. The boy had grown 3 inches since spring and could swing a hammer without bending the nail, a fact he was enormously proud of. He no longer flinched at loud noises. He rode the fence line with Silas every morning, sitting straight in the saddle with a concentration that made him look much older than his 9 years. Nettie had turned 11 in July. They celebrated with a cake Clara baked and a book Agnes Harper special ordered from the catalog. Nettie read it in 2 days and then read it again. She had started calling Silas Pa sometime during the summer, casually, as if it had always been the word she used and no one had made a fuss about it, because making a fuss would have ruined the quiet perfection of the thing. Thomas was still the quietest of the children, but he was no longer silent. He talked to the animals. He talked to the dog Silas had brought home from a neighboring ranch, a brown and white hound with one torn ear, and a disposition so gentle that Rosie could climb on its back without drawing a growl. Thomas named the dog Captain and took him everywhere, and the sound of boy and dog running through the tall grass had become as much a part of the ranch as the creak of the windmill. Rosie was 3 now, healthy, strong. Her cough was gone. Her hair curled wild in the wind, and she had learned to say no with a firmness that suggested she would be a formidable woman someday. She carried a basket of wildflowers everywhere she went, emptying it and refilling it daily, as if the flowers were a currency she was saving for some important transaction. Only she understood. Clara stood in the kitchen doorway one October afternoon with flour on her hands and the afternoon light falling warm across the yard. She was humming. The same hymn she had started humming in the spring, but it had words now. She had remembered them somewhere around August, and they came back to her a few at a time, like old friends returning from a long journey. Silas rode in from the east pasture. He stopped his horse at the gate and sat there for a moment looking at the house. Smoke rose from the chimney, straight and white against the blue sky. The windmill turned behind the barn, slow and steady. The children's voices carried across the yard, mixed with the dog barking and the sound of Nettie reading aloud from the porch, and the particular noise that Rosie made when she was happy, a shriek that was half laughter and half declaration of war. Silas looked at all of it: the house, the children, the woman in the doorway with flour on her apron and a song in her throat. And for the first time in more years than he could count, the weight he had carried since the night Eli died was gone. Not forgotten, not erased, but set down. The way you set down a stone you have been holding so long, you forgot it was in your hand. He had punished himself for 5 years. slept in a shed, worked until his hands bled, refused every comfort because he believed he did not deserve it. And then a woman with a broken wagon and 4 hungry children had come down the road in a blizzard, half dead and still walking, and she had shown him what courage actually looked like. Not the absence of fear, not the denial of pain, just the decision to keep going, one foot in front of the other, even when there is no guarantee that anything waits at the end of the road. She had shown him that worth is earned, that love is not a rescue, that standing beside someone is not the same as carrying them. He thought about the silver button on her wrist, the one from Eli's coat. She wore it every day. It had turned dark with wear and weather, the metal smoothing down to a soft shine that caught the light when she kneaded bread or hung laundry, or reached out to touch his arm as he passed through the kitchen. She never took it off, not once. And every time he saw it, he remembered that some things do not need to be valuable to be precious. They just need to be chosen. The dog barked. Thomas laughed. A screen door slammed somewhere, and then Nettie's voice carried across the yard calling Rosie in for supper. The ordinary sounds of an ordinary evening on an ordinary ranch in the Montana Territory. Except that none of it was ordinary. All of it was earned. Every sound, every smell, every moment of peace had been purchased with sweat and grief and frozen ground and miles of snow. Clara looked up from the doorway and saw him sitting at the gate. She smiled. It was a small smile, quiet and real, not promising anything beyond the present moment. He smiled back. Then he rode through the gate and came home. From the road, if you were passing through, you might look down into the valley and see a ranch house sitting low against the hills. Nothing remarkable. A windmill, a barn, a few sheds, cattle in the pasture, chickens in the yard. The kind of place that dots the Montana Territory by the hundreds, built by hands that know more about work than words. But if you look at closer, you might see a woman in the doorway singing. You might see children running. You might see a man riding in from the fields with something on his face that looks like peace. And if you had been on that road a year ago in December, in the worst of the snow, you might have seen something else. A broken wagon tilted in a ditch. A woman on her knees in the white pulling at reins that led to nothing, with 4 children wrapped in blankets behind her, and nothing ahead but distance and doubt. The same road, the same woman, but everything had changed. The road that had been covered in snow was dry now, and grass grew on both sides of it. The road that had seemed like it led to nothing now led to a house with light in the windows and smoke in the chimney and laughter spilling out the door. From death to life, from burden to belonging, from a road that went nowhere to a road that led home.